The world's on fire. Our river's gone dry. The rich are getting richer. They've left us out here to die. Mass migration. We got no place to hide. Who's against us? Who's on our side? Are they too dumb or are they just in on it? Liars and cheaters, a red-hot grip. Ditch the gaslighting gas bag that speaks in code. He's a faker, a shaker, a pontificating pantload. In this house of mirrors, we've hit the wall before it's too late. Let's go. Come on, y'all. It's border to border and coast to coast. It's real, it's facts, and it ain't no hoax. It's Podcast by George, and it's showtime, folks. Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. That is the appropriate opening for this show, folks. We're going to be talking about climate, war, and healthcare with a hero of mine, folks. Coming on the podcast by George live line is the great Medea Benjamin from CODEPINK. Go to their site, codepink.org. Sign up, follow them, get our newsletter. A lot of people on this show are already going to be familiar with Medea, but if you're not, that's the thing to do. And we're going to be talking about her new book. I want to get this up on screen. This thing is winging its way to me as we speak, and it is War in Ukraine. And it's making sense of a senseless conflict, which it indeed is. But because it's the first time she's on my show, I want to go back here and give her bio. Medea Benjamin is a co-founder of the women-led peace group CODEPINK. She's also co-founder of the human rights group Global Exchange, the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, Unfreeze Afghanistan, which advocates for returning the $7 billion of Afghan funds frozen in U.S. banks right now. And I think it may have taken a step beyond that. I don't know. I think we have assumed that money. We've spent it, I think. ACERE, the Alliance for Cuba Engagement and Respect, and the Nobel Peace Prize for Cuban Doctors Campaign. Now, Medea has been an advocate for social justice for over 50 years, folks. Described as one of America's most committed and most effective fighters for human rights by New York Newsday and one of the high-profile leaders of the peace movement by the LA Times, she was one of 1,000 exemplary women from 140 countries nominated to receive the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the millions of women who do the essential work of peace worldwide. Now, she's author of 10 books, including Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control. We're going to be talking about them damn drones a little bit on the show today. Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection, and Inside Iran, the real history and politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Her most recent book, I had that up on screen earlier so that you can look for it. There it is again, The War in Ukraine. And it was written with Nicholas J.S. Davies. He's great, too, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. Her articles appear regularly in outlets such as The Hill, Salon, Common Dreams, and The Progressive. Her Twitter handle, follow her on Twitter. I'll have these addresses up during the show. And, of course, it is at Medea Benjamin. So I'm going to take this off screen, folks. I'm going to bring this over and click that. And we're going to say good morning to Medea Benjamin as the bell goes off, which is a good beginning, a good start. Hi, Medea.
Good morning. Hi. Good to be on with you, George.
Man, I'm just really delighted to have you on here. And I've been telling people this on my show, Medea, and I don't tell them often enough. I'm really shocked and surprised by how many people that would consider themselves to be progressive, would consider themselves to be leftists or supporters of this war in Ukraine, of sending these bombs into Ukraine to blow up the planet, it seems like. And I tell people on my show that you can be anti-sexism, you can be anti-racism, you can be anti-climate destruction, anti-income inequality, anti-corporate healthcare, all of those things that progressives consider themselves to be. But if you're not anti-war, if you're not opposed to what is happening in Ukraine, you ain't a progressive. You're not left. You're on the right side of the political spectrum. So I want to make that point right off the top. And again, thank you for all that you do in this marvelous new book that I don't have yet because it's coming. It's going to be a Christmas gift for my wife and I. I ordered it off of the CODEPINK site instead of Amazon. I hope that maybe gets you a couple of more bucks for the cause there. But I'm really looking forward to getting this new book. I'm going to bring it up on screen. I want you to explain again what the motivation was for writing it.
Yes, well, I love your opening, George, because I think that's so true.
Yes.
That how can you be for a national healthcare system, but be for spending over $100 billion for a war that's not winnable? How can you be for um, uh, any of these ways that we can improve people's lives in this country, and not think that spending all that money on war is a negative thing? And it's so much the mainstream media that people have unfortunately been listening to that have colored their vision of this whole thing. So yes, it's a good thing as you pose it, which is to say that you can't be progressive and be supporting war, and be part of this whole idea that we are the good ones, and we are the ones that get to determine, who is going to live and who is going to die in this ongoing war.
And I know, even though I don't have the book, you're going to lay it bare for folks because I maybe the overarching theme of everything is the reason people are supporting this war is how effective the propaganda is, how brainwashed we have become by the media in this country, in particular, that people are lining up behind this thing. I mean, for me personally, it's really shocking. It's always been there. I've always been aware of it, but now more than ever.
Well, right. It's a real disconnect when you have the people who are questioning the blank check to Ukraine, the people who are questioning whether this is actually even good for Ukraine, are the ones who are on the more extreme right in this country, and that those on the left are willing to go along with what the administration is saying, because it's a Democratic administration. We at CODEPINK have never been partisan about our views on war. We have protested George Bush. We protested Barack Obama. We protest anybody who is pushing us, and pushing the militarization of our foreign policy. And so I think, unfortunately, there are many people who look at this through a partisan lens. If there's a Democrat in the White House, well, it must be a good war. And that I think is partially where we stand today. It's the media, but it's also the partisan politics that is so destructive, and so colors people's views about policies. And I would add another thing, George, is that unfortunately, most people don't pay attention to foreign policy. When you look at the list of what people care about, like in the midterm elections, foreign policy barely registers, and yet it affects us. And people don't see the connection between spending almost $1 trillion on the Pentagon, and not having a decent healthcare system, or a decent college education at prices that young people can afford, or any of those things that make for a more civilized society.
And we're going to get to some of that. I'd like to get to all of it. And we're going to spend as much time on this show as Medea can give us. So anytime you got to jump out of here, you tell me, Medea. But I want to get going here because this is kind of the most topical thing that's happening right now. And to preface this, and I've mentioned this on my show recently, I'm a big believer in precedent. I'm a big believer in once bitten, twice shy. I look at you. I mentioned Dennis Kucinich the other day. You folks have been correct right down the line with all of these conflicts, all of these wars, and most notably, my God, that $1 million deaths in civilians in Iraq that you were correct about. So I'm following you. I'm listening to folks like you and Dennis Kucinich when it comes to these issues, and not these warmongers. And you've been warning all along that sending these weapons into Ukraine is going to result in escalation. Okay, let me bring this up on screen. Here's our first article that I want to show folks, if I can get this to come up. There it is. Russia claims Kyiv hit its air bases and it's firing more missiles. Ukraine, AP, and of course, the AP has its own issues here. We're going to mention that a little bit later, too. But Ukrainian drones, and again, Medea knows all about these damn drones, struck 2 air bases deep inside Russian territory. The Kremlin said Monday, shortly before Russian forces unleashed a massive missile barrage in Ukraine that struck homes and buildings and killed civilians. And that little line there always amazes me, Medea, because they always talk about civilians getting killed like it's news. In war, that's who dies. more than soldiers. Civilians get killed. That is what we're talking about. It's war, folks. The unprecedented attack in Russia threatened a major escalation of the 9-month war because it hit an airfield housing bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons. President Vladimir Putin has threatened to use all available means to defend his land, a remark many have interpreted to include nuclear weapons. Okay, now the drones, I think, were kind of old school drones. They weren't these modern day missiles that we're sending in there, but it's kind of a step process. I think that's what's coming next. And look what's happening. They're already talking about escalation, and that's what you've been warning about.
Well, yeah, you said so many things in that last comment that I want to just mention. One is that we were right. And, it would be nice if I love being on your show. It would be nice if I was also on CNN or MSNBC or got an op-ed in the Washington Post or the New York Times instead of the websites that I love, but they're so much smaller. And so, yeah, it's quite amazing in our society. The ones who were right all along on these issues are marginalized.
Yeah,
and the ones who are wrong get to be the pundits over and over again.
I don't want to interrupt you, but those are the guys that the great Chris Hedges calls the pimps of war. Yeah, you can tune in and see John Brennan. You can see Jim Clapper. You can see, Victoria Nuland. All of these people that were wrong, that resulted in all of this wrongful death. They're on all the time. Medea and the peace givers, the peace supporters, they don't get on these shows. And so therefore, that in itself kind of creates the propaganda paradigm.
Well, that's right. And we're seeing it in such force right now with the inability of the American people to get another opinion. Once in a while, you'll see in the Washington Post or the New York Times an op-ed that says, well, maybe it's time for negotiations, but it's the rarity. What you get most of the time is this fallacy that the Ukrainians can win on the battlefield, just send them more weapons, that the victory is around the corner. And you'd think for the American people who heard this about Afghanistan for 20 years, that if we just had a surge in troops, or we just sent another tens of billions of dollars, that we would be able to defeat the Taliban. And then after 20 years, we leave and they're back in there. So it is remarkable that the American people are so gullible about these wars, so willing to accept these pundits as being the ones who are the truth tellers. And it's very sad to see, George, because it's over and over and over again. I've been doing this work since the time of the Vietnam War, and I think one thing we should learn is, our media, mainstream media lies to us, our military lies to us, the White House lies to us, and we've got to seek the truth in other places, like on your show.
Well, and I can bring this up on screen too, because I talked about this. That's exactly right. When this story came out, the Associated Press reporting that those Russian missiles had gone into Poland. I posted on all of my social media basically that, oh my God, I'm seeing the ghost of the Archduke Ferdinand in World War I. And you think to yourself, well, George, this is history. You can't expect people to, Medea's point, to, be that dialed into issues of war and history. Now we're talking about modern history, folks. Here we're talking about my generation, the Vietnam War, that Gulf of Tonkin incident, fake. I mean, the first Gulf War is an example. Those babies being thrown out of incubators, fake. Libya, the soldiers being given Viagra to rape the civilian population, fake. Over and over again, all of these, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, maybe the biggest fakery that ever went on. And so now we're reporting these things and people are taking them on face value. And again, they're wrong, Medea.
Yeah, but one thing I do want to say, George, that missile could have easily come from Russia. There are errant missiles all the time. The accidents happen, unintentional crossing of borders. So while that one, we could breathe a sigh of relief because the Polish government said that it wasn't coming from Russia, and that was accepted by the Biden administration. Let's not be fooled that this could this kind of thing could either happen as a false flag, as you were saying, but it also could be true. And imagine if the missile did come from Russia, what would have been the result? 2 people died, which is horrific, but that could have been an incident that led to a much wider war. And that's why this thing is so dangerous. You know, Zelensky himself would like to get the U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine. They would like to get U.S. air cover. He's been calling for that since this war began. And so whether it's by a false flag operation or just something that happened and an attack was against the border, whether it's in Poland or Romania or somewhere else in a NATO country, this could certainly escalate. And, you know, George, this is something that the administration is extremely fearful of. And that's why the only ones who are talking to the Russians are not the diplomats like Anthony Blinken, who should be talking, but it's the ones like the head of the National Security Council or the Secretary of Defense or even the head of the CIA, William Burns, because they want to talk to the Russians about how we're not going to escalate this, how to not let it lead to World War III or to nuclear war.
Yeah, and General Mark Milley, another example here, just a couple of weeks ago, that guy was talking for talks. And he was calling for negotiations because he is understanding and fearful of how quickly this can escalate with a false flag or false reporting from intel sources that are worthless, that foisted these other wars upon us, like that Associated Press reporting. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the book, because this goes back to my original premise. I'm really kind of shocked and surprised at the number of people that are supporting the war, and you can't do it on the show, obviously, but give us a quick thumbnail of the situation in Ukraine, which so many people seem to be unaware of. I'm reminded of Roger Waters when he was interviewed by the guy on CNN, that Smirkomish or whatever his name is. God, you need to read more. I mean, you just don't understand the history of what's going on here. I know that's in your book. Tell us about it.
Well, yes, we wrote the book because we thought it was so important to give people a basic primer about how this war happened. You know, people don't pay attention to history, and when they see the Russian invasion, all they think of is this just happened out of nowhere. And so in the book, while it is a very basic book, it's also a very step-by-step account of what happened, particularly after 1990, the breakup of the Soviet Union, how this led to an agreement with the Gorbachev about the non-expansion of NATO, something that people who support this blank check to Ukraine love to dismiss. But we go and give not only an account of all the different people who warned that an expansion of NATO eastward was going to lead exactly to this conflict, but we also have a whole chapter about NATO itself. You know, George, CODEPINK has been for years trying to sound the alarm bells about NATO as not a defensive organization, but as a dangerous offensive military alliance that is nothing to do with the North Atlantic anymore, but has been joining the U.S. on invasions such as Afghanistan and Libya, far away from the North Atlantic, but also setting its sights on Russia and on China. And that we should look at the history of NATO and recognize it as a provocative organization that has indeed been provoking Russia since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And we also look at great detail at the U.S. interference in Ukraine's internal politics. So much has been made of Russia interfering in U.S. elections, and yet here we have proof that the U.S. was intimately involved in turning a peaceful uprising against a corrupt government in Ukraine into a military violent overthrow of a government where the U.S. picked who would be the next leader of Ukraine, and really precipitated then the breakaway of the Donbas republics and the Russian takeover of Crimea. So I think it is very important to go step by step to look at how all of that happened. And then one of the very important things is that the world came together and said, we've got to do something about it. And the Minsk Accords were agreed upon by Russia and Ukraine with the support of France and Germany and the Security Council of the United Nations as a way to diffuse the conflict in the Donbass. And how, unfortunately, the leaders of Ukraine were either not able or not willing to enforce that agreement, particularly because the right-wing nationalists in Ukraine were unwilling to allow that to happen and threatened Zelensky, for example, with hanging from a tree if he indeed went ahead with what the Minsk Accords called for, which is autonomy for those republics.
You know, you talk about the great provocateur, which is the United Nations or the NATO, but that's not to excuse Russia. I mean, this is a war of aggression. I mean, it's a violation of the Nuremberg laws, according to Chris Hedges. I had him on my show. I mean, we're not Medea's opposed to war, folks. I mean, I don't ever want people to misinterpret this. But I kind of wanted to talk also about the fact that I saw where you were interviewed, I think, by Chris Hedges, and you were making this analogy about Alaska, which I had never heard before, which is kind of interesting. A lot of people talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how that's analogous to what's happening, the provocation by NATO when it comes to Russia, putting these missiles and these armaments very close to Russia's border after Russia was promised that NATO wouldn't expand east of East Germany or Germany when the solidification took place with Germany. But it's kind of akin to somebody coming along and kind of taking Alaska back. Explain that. That was a great analogy, I thought.
Well, yes. I mean, for so many people in Russia, Crimea is part of Russia. It was part of Russia for 200 years. And when it was handed over by Khrushchev to Ukraine, it was still part of the Soviet Union. It was an administrative transfer. And there are majority of people in Crimea are Russian-speaking ethnic Russians. And so the idea that Ukraine can, quote, take back Crimea is something that many Russian people think would just be impossible. Not only is it part and important militarily for the Russian Navy, but it's also just culturally and historically a part of Russia. And that's why people don't understand why it's not possible for the Ukrainians to, quote, take back Crimea without this expanding into a greater war, because the Russians are not going to give up Crimea.
All right, good. I want to keep moving here because our time is always limited with our guests here, and particularly Medea. She's very busy, and she's doing a tour here for the book as well. I wanted to bring this up because this is right off the CODEPINK.org website, CODEPINK.org. Go there, folks, and it's a call for a Christmas truce in Ukraine. This is something that people can get behind, they can get involved in. And you mentioned here on Code Pink that in 1914, amid one of the most violent conflicts of human history, a remarkable moment of peace and humanity occurred during World War I, when French, German, and British soldiers crossed trenches on Christmas Eve. For several days, enemy soldiers put down their guns and mingled to become friends. There were joint brutal burial ceremonies and prisoner swaps. They played football, ate meals together, and even sang Christmas carols, creating one of the most memorable images of peace in the midst of a horrific war. That really was. And the same spirit, Code Pink is asking you to join them in urging President Biden, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, and congressional representatives to support the International Peace Bureau's call for a Christmas truce in Ukraine. A truce, a moment of holiday peace, could pave the way for negotiations to reach a lasting security agreement to end the bloodshed once and for all. So bring that back off screen and bring Medea back in here. And Medea, a lot of people would look at that and say, Christmas truce, what is that good for? Well, it's the beginning. It's kind of like a negotiation or some diplomacy. You got to start somewhere. But the point I make on my show all the time is any day, any hour that there's a ceasefire, no matter how shaky or tenuous it is another hour, another day that people aren't being blown apart. So there's great value in it. It's a win-win any way you look at it.
Well, that's right. And there's another important point to this, which is that it's a really good organizing tool. We set out to get 100 faith-based leaders in the United States to call for this truce and to be on record that they want to see a ceasefire. And within the week, we have now over 800 leaders of people like the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Barber, or Reverend Jesse Jackson, heads of the National Council of Churches, people from the Muslim community, leaders in the Jewish community, all kinds of faith-based leaders have been very eager to sign on to this. And so getting them on record, and they have access to the White House because some of them were even part of the inauguration of President Biden. They have asked for a meeting with the White House on this. And so we're very excited that this is a sector of our community that has the moral integrity, that has the access to the White House, and that really reflects the spiritual longing of people around the world to see an end to this crisis. So we're excited about how that campaign is moving along. If people want to get their faith-based leaders on this, they can go to the peaceinukraine.org website and look under the section that calls actions. You can read the call there. And there's also a petition for the rest of us who are either or perhaps not faith-based leaders to sign on to another petition as well.
All right, I got to keep moving here. I got to keep rolling along because I got a lot of things I want to get to. Because Medea and I are in lockstep on all this stuff. It's just great to have a kindred spirit here to talk to. And I mentioned off the top that she's written this book, which we've shown on screen, and I'm encouraging everybody to go to CODEPINK and buy that thing. But she's also a regular contributor to places like Common Dreams that I follow closely. And she and Nicholas co-authored this article, which is what I call the Great Eight. 8 reasons why now is a good time for a Ukraine ceasefire and peace talks, along with the faith-based leaders worldwide. She mentioned that they're calling for this Christmas truce. Okay, let's take a spin through these 8 here. I want to bring these up on screen, get this big enough that I can look at it here. It says, the first and most urgent reason is the incredible daily death and suffering in Ukraine and the chance to save millions of more Ukrainians from being forced to leave their homes, their belongings, and be conscripted menfolk they may never see again. And that conscription is already happening up in Russia. Neither side can achieve a decisive military victory. With its recent military gains, Ukraine is in a good negotiating position. Talk about this one a little bit, Medea, because, again, I kind of wonder why people are supporting this war. A couple of things. People really believe that Ukraine can defeat Russia. And I tell them, God, that's like believing that Trump won the 2020 election. What the hell? I mean, what are you smoking? What are you drinking? I mean, that's not going to happen. Ukraine cannot win this war, as this number 2 on the list shows. And the other thing that people talk about all the time that I really want you to address is that, well, the United States and NATO would like to negotiate a settlement on this, but you can't make Putin negotiate. Putin won't talk. And that's not true as far as what I can understand. Can you talk about that?
Well, the Russian government has been trying to talk all along, and they certainly tried to talk before they invaded, and they were summarily dismissed by the United States and by NATO. Then there were talks that were going on in March and early April that Turkey was mediating, and those talks fell apart when the West, in both the UK and the US, told Zelensky that he could win and that the U.S. would support them all the way. And then there have been talks on specific issues like negotiating the grain deal to get that grain out of Ukraine, negotiating to get the atomic energy representatives into the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. There have been negotiations for prisoner swaps. There are many specific negotiations that are going on now. What that has to move towards is negotiations about how to end the war. And I think with Turkey, the way it has been successful in mediating these other things, it could move on to that. But there has to be an agreement by all sides. Will the Russians negotiate? I think the Russians are anxious to end this war. There is growing disenchantment within Russia about this war. when they called up 300,000 new reservists, there were a lot of people who fled the country because they didn't want to fight. There are many reasons for the Russians to go to the negotiating table. And when Biden says that he doesn't, that Putin is not ready to talk, I think we should respond by saying, well, why don't you reach out and ask him to talk? Because from everything we hear from the Russian side, they have been constantly saying, yes, we are ready to talk. We are ready to talk. It is the Ukrainians and the US. Now, of course, as you said earlier, we have to recognize that Russia is the aggressor. That Russia is the one who physically started this war by invading Ukraine. But I do think that they want an off-ramp, and that is something that Biden himself has said, that Russia needs an off-ramp, and so it's important to provide him one.
I've got all these slides. I want to get to them, but just to hear you talk there, I'm really looking forward to reading about this in your book. And it has to do with Zelensky because he's become like a folk hero with some people, even on the left here in this country. This Benny Rooster strutting around over there in his camo T-shirt that's too tight. And this guy in my book is not a folk hero at all. To me, he looks like, again, a CIA puppet. He looks like an American lapdog. He was involved in these negotiations that were, I thought, getting close in March or April of this year. And then Boris Johnson, NATO, and the United States swept in and waved him off. And he's kind of just doing what the United States and NATO tell him to do, it looks to me like. What's your take? You know, again, I know it's in the book, but what's your take on Zelensky?
Well, I guess I see it a little differently, George. I see that he was a person who campaigned on a peace platform, that he was going to solve the conflict in the Donbass, that he was going to meet with those leaders. And as soon as he came in, just like his predecessor, when they tried to actually do that, they are attacked by the right in their own country, who threaten their lives, threaten the lives of their families, and refuse to allow him to go ahead with the promise that he made when he was campaigning. So I see that he is somebody who's been swept up by the events. And of course, once the war started, he became a wartime leader of a country that was invaded. And then you get all the nationalist sentiments that rightly emerge when a country's sovereignty is violated. And he has been playing the role of the wartime leader. I think that he has gone way too far now in losing the compromises that he had talked about earlier on, when he said that it was clear that Ukraine was not going to be able to join NATO, that Ukraine would have to be a neutral country, to now pushing the other extreme of saying that Ukraine should be fast-tracked to become a member of NATO. But I see that, George, as a negotiating position. If the U.S. would push Zelensky to negotiate, I think he would have to negotiate, because let's face it, he can't continue this war without the billions of dollars every single month that the U.S. taxpayers are pouring in to not only send the weapons, but also to keep his government going. With their economy collapsed, they need close to $2 billion every single month just to keep the lights on in the government buildings. And so the U.S. has a great role to play in pushing Zelensky to negotiate. If the U.S. did that, I think he would have more leeway within his country, and facing those nationalists who refused to let him negotiate earlier, he would have more ability to go to negotiate now.
Well, let's hope he's not fearful for his own life. I read somewhere that, those Azov battalions, the ultra right in his country, has threatened him, like, hanging from the highest tree, as you were talking about earlier. Let me bring this up now. I want to get through this grade 8, as I call it. U.S. government officials, especially in the Republican Party, are starting to talk of the prospect for continuing this enormous level of military and economic support. Now, this, again, is some reason for hope that there might be some negotiations, diplomacy, and peace coming up here. But these are kind of strange bedfellows. Now, it may be for partisanship. You talked about that earlier, Medea, but you'll take friends and allies when it comes to peace anywhere. What about the fact that it's the Republicans that seem to be on the side of peace, at least in Ukraine right now?
Well, yes, it's very strange. And whether it comes to questioning the blank check or things like calling for an audit of where all this money is going, it was Marjorie Taylor Greene who brought this up in the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House. And they came close to winning because a lot of the more mainstream Republicans sided with her and said we should indeed have more of a accountability of where all this money is going. It didn't in the end pass through that committee because there were all of the Democrats voted against it and some of the Republicans as well. But it does indicate that there is more and will be more questioning of this blank check. Kevin McCarthy, who might be the Speaker of the House himself, said at one time that there would not be a blank check. He walked that back when he was pushed by members, the more hawkish members of his own party. But the fact is that there will be more questioning. And this is coming at a time when there is more questioning from the American people, as the opinion polls show, which is quite remarkable, George, when you see, as we talked about earlier, that the corporate media has been pretty much in lockstep in favor of the U.S. support for Ukraine, that more and more Americans are seeing through that and saying that perhaps this is not in the best interest of us here in the United States, that perhaps negotiations are a good thing. So I think as the Republicans take over the House, there will be much more of an opening to at least have a discussion of this, which we haven't had in the past.
And this is some of this reporting and polling that Medea is talking about. American support for Ukraine is flagging, a poll says. Now, this isn't an ultra-left publication. This is in USA Today. Nearly half of Americans, 47%, now say Washington should urge Kyiv to negotiate a peace deal as soon as possible. Now, that's up from 38% just this past July, according to this new poll. And 48% of Americans believe Washington should support Ukraine as long as it takes. Okay, down from 58%, so that's good news, according to the survey by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And as Medea was talking about, Republicans have led the decline in support. A smaller majority of Republicans now support the United States giving military aid, 35% down, 68% in July, 80% in March, and economic assistance, 50% down from 64% in July and 74% in March. Democratic support has held relatively steady. It's a trend line, Medea. You've got to be cheered by the trending here.
Absolutely. And you see different statistics in different polls, of course, depending on how the question was asked. But the trend line is very obvious that the longer this war drags on, the more the American people start to question it. And that's a good thing. In the end, we find that it's the people in Congress who are the last ones to get what is happening. But in the end, they tend to look at those public opinion polls, see which way the wind is blowing, and they too will start to question this.
Well, before we run out of time, I want to try to make it through this grade 8. I think we're up to number 5 here. And of course, folks, we're talking to Medea Benjamin. She co-authored this article in Common Dreams, where this came from, with the great Nicholas J.S. Davies. And number 4 here, actually, is the war is causing upheavals in Europe. Tell us what's happening there.
Well, it's quite remarkable what is happening in Europe. There are still European countries, especially the ones like the Baltic states and Poland and Romania, that remain steadfastly supportive of this war. But in other parts of Europe, there's a major shift that is happening while the people of Europe are suffering from the sanctions that have been put on the Russian energy. With the prices of energy going up and the war profiteering that's going on by U.S. energy companies that are taking advantage of this, there is a lot of discontent in Europe. We see protests happening in various countries that have had, where tens of thousands of people have come out on the street calling for an end to the war in Ukraine. We see more and more of the governments saying that there has to be a settlement. And even Macron in France, who just met with President Biden and had a press conference that made it look like they were both on the same page, he has since said that there have to be negotiations, and the legitimate security interests of Russia have to be taken into account. So as this war drags on, the cold winter sets in, and the Europeans are experiencing tremendous blowback with the inflation soaring. There will be more and more calls within Europe as well to go to the negotiating table.
Well, the primary motivation should be to end all war. The motivation to end the suffering and the death. I mean, you don't ever want that. But I'm reminded of Cat Stevens and the Peace Train song. Let's keep this train rolling, folks. I want to bring this comment up on screen here. My mouth isn't working because here's the way I put it to people. This is my opportunity to talk to Medea Benjamin, but I promote this, Medea, by telling people they can log on and ask you questions and comment themselves. This is from John Roberts that follows my show. He says, seems to me Russia can achieve a decisive military victory, and it's planning a larger offensive. I don't think the West is ready for any Russian victory. How do we stop continual Western escalation? Well, there's a couple of things there, but I think John writes the first part of this comment in particular, Medea.
Well, I don't think the Russians will be able to achieve the victory that they wanted to. I think in the end, there's going to have to be compromises on both sides, with the line drawn along the Donbass and allowing people in the Donbass to have an internationally supervised referendum. I think the Russians will hold on to Crimea. But, let's not really, yes, the Western media is saying that Russia is being defeated, that they're running out of weapons. I don't think that is the case either. But I do think that there is a stalemate, and that while one side might achieve a temporary victory and the other side will come back even stronger, there will be no very definitive victory on the battlefield. And that is why this war will potentially just drag on and on if indeed one side or the other thinks that they can achieve it on the ground.
Here, Roger's keeping me honest. This is a comment. I should have asked about this. He says he loves the Christmas truce idea. Are cross-conflict ties between mothers of soldiers, resistors, scientists, and artists gaining traction? Are there any big plans in the works? And he's talking about this Christmas truce. I mean, we're getting close to Christmas here. So is this going to happen? I think it should also involve Chinese and global calls for demilitarization.
Beautiful comment. And yes, we have to move in that direction. I don't think this Christmas truce will happen because it's too soon. I don't think we've built up enough of that groundswell that he is talking about. But it has to, this is the beginning of it, because this Christmas truce, for example, is being called for all over Europe as well. And let's remember the Pope has been very, very good on this issue. But there needs to be more. And while the Europeans are getting out into the streets in large numbers, we have to do that as well. There's a call for a protest on the streets of New York City on January 14th. And people can find out more about that by going to peaceinukraine.org as well. There have to be more of these ties. And I'm looking at it by sector. For example, we're writing a call for women around the world to rise up and say that enough of war. We're calling on environmentalists to say that this is a destruction of the environment. And this is one of the points in that 8-point piece that you've been referring to, George, about how catastrophic this war is for the environment. So we're trying to get sector by sector groups to come out and join in this call. But as you said, it should be a global call. And you're so right. Getting people in places like China and all over Europe, Latin America, and Asia is the direction that we have to move in.
Folks, we're talking to Medea Benjamin of CODEPINK.org. I really want to get your response to this because I looked at this comment. It took me a little while to pick up what she's putting down here, but this is from Suzanne. She follows my podcast. And because you will hear people defending the military action in Ukraine, and they'll want to promote this war for sovereignty uh, reasons. Well, Suzanne says, in my honest opinion, Ukraine lost its sovereign status to U.S. interests well before Russia started their military operation. That's an interesting angle. I mean, does Ukraine really have sovereignty, or are they a satellite of NATO and of the United States? And that was lost after the 2014 Maidan coup. I mean, that's when they lost their sovereignty, so to speak. What do you think about that, Medea?
Yeah, that's an interesting comment to look at it that way. Certainly, after 2014, it was the Ukrainian government was very much in the pocket of NATO and the West, and all of the training that the Western countries did starting in 2015 was really a preparation for a war rather than a preparation for making sure that those Minsk agreements that were signed in 2015 were actually implemented. So it is an interesting way to look at that as a loss of sovereignty. On the other hand, I think we do have to recognize that the sovereignty issue is kind of a red herring when you look at something like Crimea, that has been more a part of Russia in its history than it has been a part of Ukraine. So there are border disputes that have never been resolved since the breakup of the Soviet Union, not just the ones in Ukraine, but in elsewhere like Azerbaijan and Armenia. And these things have to be settled in a form of compromise, not just on an ideological commitment to sovereignty.
Oh, we're running out of time here. I guess, and if anybody doesn't think that sovereignty has been lost in Ukraine, I guess I would say if they don't think they're a proxy of the United States, they're involved in a proxy war right now. I think there's wide consensus on that this really is an effort on the part of the West to bring down Russia, or to harm Russia. This unipolar world that we live in, to further reinforce the Western dominance all over the globe, and Ukraine happens to be the battleground for this. Well, before we run out of time here, I guess the last thing that I wanted to underline or emphasize here, Medea, aside from people ordering this book and learning all about the past and the present, I tell people all the time, you can't know where we're heading if you don't know where we've been. And again, I know that was a motivation for the book.
Absolutely, that's so true. I mean, you can't look at what are the potential solutions to this conflict if you don't know where it came from. And that's why we feel the book is so important. It's been interesting how many people have been buying the book as a Christmas present for their friends or relatives who disagree with them on this, saying it might not be the present they wanted, but it's the present they need. The American people need to know the history. They need to know how we got to this point. They need to know that a solution is possible, that you can sit down with the Russians. You can and you must negotiate. And that's our message, is to get the American people not only to understand the context of this conflict, but to get involved, to contact their Congress people, to ask their congressperson to come out with a statement, a tweet, a whatever, saying they support this call for negotiations, to badger their mainstream media and ask, write letters to the editor, but ask to have voices for peace on the corporate media as well, to get out in the streets like the call for the January 14th protest. There are so many different ways that we can get involved, and we must get involved in trying to end this conflict.
Yeah, and I guess if you're going to contact your representative, lean on that religion angle, lean on that humanity issue. I mean, who can't support a Christmas truce, for God's sake? I mean, who can't give the troops a break in a war on Christmas. All of the politicians are running around trying to, out Christian one another. Well, let's lean a little bit on their Christianity.
Absolutely. It's a moral imperative. How could you not call for a Christmas truce? That is right. Ask your congressperson to support the Christmas truce.
Because it does have to get settled. That's something that people are missing too. They think that one side's going to defeat the other one militarily. It's going to get settled. There's going to be a negotiation. Diplomacy is going to happen. It always does. It always will. And it's going to happen here. Why not sooner, but rather than later, rather than more lives being lost?
Well, I don't want to end this on a negative note, but if it's not diplomacy, it could be the mushroom cloud. It could be the nuclear war that could end life on this planet. So for those of us who want to see this planet continue for our children, grandchildren, and those who come after, we better get involved and not let this go to a wider war. Stop it now. Get involved in pushing for a peace negotiation, a Christmas truce, a ceasefire. Put down the guns.
Yeah, and get yourself a Christmas gift here. The book, again, is available at the place to get it, I think, is CODEPINK.org. Let me see if I can get it up on screen here again. There it is. The War in Ukraine, Sense of a Senseless Conflict. Man, this is great. Medea Benjamin, again, I couldn't thank you more. Thanks for coming on this podcast by George Liveline. I hope to circle back here again soon. I know you're very busy, but we'll catch up with you here, I hope, in the new year.
Thank you so much for having me on, George. Have a great day.
Yeah, great. And folks, if you like Podcast by George, there she is. Let me bring myself back in full screen here. If you like Podcast by George and you want to see guests like the great Medea Benjamin and Chris Hedges, I mentioned, my God, I've had Matt Taibbi on. And he's all over the news right now. If you can go back and see the show that I did with him. If you like guests like these, go to podcastbygeorge.com. And pick a badge, a platform, a place where you would like to be notified when we go live, Facebook and YouTube, or where these live streams are seen. Also on Twitter, you can find me there. But the audio versions are available in long form. They're recorded and they're out there for you to get on iTunes, Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, Deezer, Amazon Audio, I think has it even, places like that. But that is going to do it, folks. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.